Hi, welcome to week 4. We're going to be covering chapter 7 through, I believe, chapter 12. So let's just jump right on into it. Again, at any time, if you want to just pause the video, play around with the code, see what you can do, I highly, highly recommend that you try that. Just try new things, try different things, see how it works. So again, if you want to play around, pause the video, play around with a little bit, then come back to the video. Okay, so chapter 7 gets into this thing called timers, and timers are just exactly what they think they do. They basically will pause, they'll do certain things. Again, you'll notice a lot of these chapters are fairly short. So let's go ahead and open up. Let's go ahead and open up chapter 7, set timeout. So let's take a look at this. So here I've got just a regular function called showAlert, and it just displays the word move. Then I come down here and I say let timeout equal. Now this is a built-in function for JavaScript. It's called set timeout. And what we're going to do within there, we're going to call the showAlert function after 5,000 milliseconds, which ends up being 5 seconds. Okay, so the 1,000 is basically 1 second. So if we run this, it comes up, and you'll notice after 5 seconds, it says move. Okay. Now, the one thing I do want to point out, they say if you do need to cancel this, there's what's called a clear timeout built-in method. And I just say clear timeout, the timeout ID. So here's that variable timeout ID. When I say clear timeout, it basically stops the entire timer process. So if I come back out here and let me rerun that again. And as soon as that comes up, before it gets to 5, I can click on the click me button. It just executed that and it stopped that timeout process. So it's not going to happen again. So there's a way to stop these. So the set timeout is a way to, we can do certain things. So again, the set timeout is a great way to have some kind of a buffer. So maybe it's going to display in 10 seconds unless they do some certain thing. Maybe you can build this into a game, whatever the case may be. Now the next timer option is what's called a set interval. And if we take a look at that, it's a different one in that so this time I say let thing to print equal the null value. And then I say function to draw, thing to print, I'm going to print a hashtag and then a BR, a line break tag. And then I'm going to do a document.writeLN, so it's going to write it right on the screen, and it's going to say, and it's going to call the function, or it's going to print thing to print, okay? And so I'm going to say set the interval, draw text, so it's going to call that function draw text, and it's got 2,000, which means every 2 seconds it's going to call that. So when we run this, when it runs, every 2 seconds, it's going to print a hashtag and a line break. Now, if you look on page 81, where it says the looping was set, at the very bottom of the first paragraph, it says, it keeps executing in the code in a loop forever. So there's really, you can stop this with what's called a, what they call it a clear interval, and you can clear the interval with the ID field as well. So we could have another button that pops up that says, hey, clear this interval, and it would go ahead and stop that. But yeah, so that's one thing. So they said that on page 82, they do have one where they have moved circles, and they divide 1,000 by 60, which is a millisecond value for 60 frames per second. So it's kind of, so if you needed to move something around the screen automatically, you could do that, and you can, again, you can manipulate that second part of the parameter, which is the milliseconds. You can actually program that to be very, very specific on how fast or slow you want that to basically pop up. Okay. Yeah, so again, the only way to kill this is to actually stop that web page. Again, if you go to that code pen, you're going to probably find some set intervals there. And I did include some links inside of here so that we can, so for example, there is there's also another one they talk about called request on frames. They don't have any actual examples in the book, but if you copy this right here, copy link, and then let's go ahead and paste it into here. It talks about the animation frame. So what this does, so here's the text we got. Now they're using a var. Again, we make sure we always use let. So they got a global ID, and they got a function repeat often. And inside there, they're going to include a div tag and append it to body. Okay, we don't know how, we haven't discussed this yet. I don't know if we are. That might be in the advanced class. And then it's going to basically say global ID equal to request animation frame repeat often. So it basically keeps calling itself. So this particular item here, it keeps calling itself. Now we do have two buttons. We've got a start button and a stop button. And so this is basically what it looks like. So when I click the stop, it basically executes the cancel animation frame. And what it's going to cancel, it's going to cancel the global ID, this guy, okay? This var global ID. When I click start, that basically turns on the request animation frame, and it calls to repeat often, and it will continue on until we hit stop again. Now the only way to clear that is to basically do a refresh of the page, and that will basically clear everything out and start the whole process all over again. But just realize we do have request animation frame, and that will actually draw things on the screen, and that's how we do a lot of different gaming type things and putting things on the screen in a certain way. We can utilize that as well. So 3 different types of timer. We've got a set timeout. We've got the set interval, and then we have the request animation frame. And that was pretty much all they wanted to cover in that particular part of that chapter. So let's go ahead and move on to chapter 8. And chapter 8 is kind of a short chapter as well, because they really just discuss when we declare variables, who can see them, who has access to them, that type of thing. So the very first thing that it talks about is global scope. And probably the best thing to do is just open up the global scope. Again, when I say, because you're going to have access to all of these programs, where you can then you can actually open these up and kind of follow along as well. So I open up chapter 8 global scope. And so what this is trying to let you know is this. I create a variable called counter, and I set it to 0. Since it's right here inside of the script, everything inside of the script tag has access to that variable. So it is a global variable. It can be seen by everyone. So when this function is called and it says return counter, it's going to basically, and then alert calls return count. Everything has access to a counter because it is a global variable. So when we execute the global scope, it basically displays the 0, okay, because everyone has access to that particular variable. So that's global. Now we have what's called local scope. And so let's take a look at local scope. I think I'm going to call it block scope. So we take a look at block scope. And so what this means is this. Let foo is a global variable. It can be seen by everyone. But what they wanted you to know here is I say alert foo, and then below that I say foo equals hello. So let's take a look at this. So I declare the variable here, I use it here, and then I set it here. Well, guess what's going to happen? This guy's going to be undefined. When it tries to do an alert foo, it's going to say that's undefined because nothing's there. And then I set it here. So what they're trying to show you is, hey, scope also means you can't use something until it's defined. So we really need to move this foo equals hello above the alert. Now the next thing we want to look at is this function, is the price right cost? And then we create a variable called total. Okay. Now the thing about total is, since it's in between that brace and that brace, nothing outside of this function can see total. So that is a local variable. It's local to this block between that brace and that brace. That's considered a block. Now everything inside here has access to total. There's even another, or actually there's an if statement here that says let warning equals true, alert total, alert not enough, alert warning. Okay. And that is the price is right. So down here, when I call is the price is right 4, it basically puts cost in there. And the very first thing it does is it takes total is equal to cost plus 1. So total is now 4. If total is greater than 3, we're going to let warning equal true, and we're going to alert total. So then we're going to basically display whatever's in that variable total. Else, we're going to alert not enough. So, and then down here we've got alert foo far, and we say var foo far is equal to hello var, and we've got alert foo let, and let foo let equals hello let. So what I want you to do is, if you go over to page 92, it talks about declaring variables with the var keyword, and it says the let and constant keywords are new additions to help you declare variables. Variables declare with the var scope to functions. They don't scope to blocks like our if-else does. If we modify the example from earlier to have our warning label declared using var instead of let, our code will look as follows. So if I make this warning up here equal to a var, okay, so let me do this first. I'm going to have that as let warning equals true, and then I'm going to basically come down here and say alert warning. Okay. Now, since we're using a let, that variable can only be seen inside of that block. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and I'm going to run block scope. The first thing you know, we get undefined because of the foo at the very beginning. And then it says 5. And it says true, and then undefined. That's that second warning, okay? So that's that warning at the end. So, in fact, I could do this. I concatenate that on there like that. And I'm going to go ahead and save this and then rerun it. And why aren't you working the way I think you should? Oh, because yeah, it's not there. So if I make that a var, I don't think this is working the way I'm planning it to. I don't know for some reason. Oh, that's what I want. Not what I wanted. Let. It's the warning I want. Okay. And oh, did I save it? Yep. Okay, let's try it again. So there's that first one. There's the 5. There's the true. There's the undefined. And well, it says with var that isn't the case, and it says with that it's the case. You can see that true is displayed. This is because let's see. That's because down here it basically gets executed, and when I do alert warning here, that should, I don't know. Block scope. Okay, let me go in. I'm gonna comment these out. Comment. What I need that. Okay, so let's try it again. So we should see alert total, alert warning, and alert warning. Okay, so let's see if we get anything here. We should see 3 alerts pop up. So there's the first one, second one, third one. Okay, 4. Why is there 4? If it's greater than 3, it's going to display the total. Then it's going to do the alert warning. Then it's going to do the alert warning. So this is going to display 5 or 4. Then the warning. Then the warning again. Because this guy calls that function. So is this not saved? All right, I'm going to do this. It keeps going back to the old copy. This is block scope. Maybe I have to re-execute it. Let me try it again. Oh, there's hello. 5 true. Okay. Block scope. So there's the hello. Okay, let me put that back. Okay, so let me try it again. So we should see, we save it, we should see alert total, alert warning, and then alert warning again. And warning is a var, so according to the book, that should still display. So there's the 5, there's the true, and then it doesn't display the second one. So for some reason, I don't know if maybe, yeah, but for some reason, this is not working the way the book says it should. We should always use the let, And the let says, hey, I'm not going to basically, you can't use me until you're basically declared, which is how variables are should be utilized always. So let's try it one more time. So do block scope. And there is 5. And why did display true? Oh, that's okay. That's what's going on there. Because this is inside of its own block, this cannot see it because it's not part of that block. So that way there, if I made it a var, now it kind of makes it a, I'm going to get rid of this warning again. So that's what's going on there. Since that's a var, this is outside of that block, it still can see that warning. So oh yeah, 4 plus 1 is 5, and then it, okay. It shouldn't be this hard. It really shouldn't. So there's the 5, there's the true, and there we go. Now, if I change that back to a let and do a save and then rerun it, we have 5, and that's it. Because that true does not execute. Because it doesn't see that, it doesn't see the total because it's no longer a var, it's a let. Okay, so now, okay, so let's go ahead and run it with these down here. We got a var and we've got a let. Let's see what happens. I don't think it's going to work the way the book says. There's 5. Yeah, it's not working the way the book says it will. So, anyways, but we did see that it does work here with when it's inside of a block inside of a block. When we use the var, it's still going to basically, when we get to this alert warning right here, it will execute it with a var. Okay, so. So a couple of things we've learned here is I cannot use a variable. When I use the let, I can't use the variable until it has something in it. If I use a var inside of a block, it will still basically be available outside of that block. So we should always use a let command. Okay. Yeah, it pretty much says that on the page 94, that the very last paragraph, it says, be sure to initialize your variables before actually using them. Okay, so the whole point of that chapter is to know where your variables live. If they live at the very top of the script, they're available to everything inside of there. If they're built inside of a block, then they're only visible to anything inside of that block. So global variables, local variables. So chapter 9 gets into this thing called closures. And so what they're trying to show you there is when we have a function, you know, it goes to the top of the function, executes to the end of the function, and that's it. That's kind of the closure. But what if we have something like we have a function inside of a function? So if we take a look at function here. So here we've got function, you say goodbye, and we alert goodbye. Then inside of there we've got a function, and I say hello, alert hello. Now remember, we don't run a function until we actually are calling it. So down here I have let something equal you say goodbye. So this function is now called. The very first thing it's going to say is goodbye. Then we have the function, which doesn't do anything, but notice inside the function we have return and I say hello. So there's function and I say hello, that gets executed here inside the very last thing of the function, and then it basically gets returned. So the closure is this. This is called the outer function, and this is called the inner function. So this outer function gets executed. The very first thing it does is it says goodbye. This function is just sitting there waiting to be called. So the very next executable line is return and I say hello. So it basically calls that function, which is alert hello. That gets put into this variable and I say hello, and that basically gets passed back to and put into the thing something. It basically gets returned right here. And so that basically gets executed and displayed as well. Now, the thing's not, the whole entire, both functions are not over until this brace is hit, and now it's basically finally over. So that's the so this is the closure for that inner function, and this is the closure for the outer function. So the whole point of this chapter is to let you know where one function begins, another function begins and ends when you have one embedded inside of another. If we look at function return, so we take a look at this guy. I have a function called calculate rectangle area. We pass in the length and the width. We return length times width. So we've seen this before. Down here I say let room area equal calculate rectangle area 10, 10. And that gets, and then I basically call alert room area. So this gets, so the variable gets set here, and then it's basically displayed here in the alert. And again, this calls the function passing 10, 10. This just multiplies 10, 10 together and returns it, and it gets put into the room area. So let's take a look, see what that looks like. And there it is, 100. So they're trying to show you that, yeah, we're one function, so where everything kind of starts and ends. So the very first thing that gets executed in this script is this line right here. And then when we call calculate area, then it calls that function, does what it needs to do, returns that value, which gets put into room area. Then the very next line it gets executed is alert room area. On page 100, it says when the inner functions are self-contained. So let's take a look. There's I've got inner function not self-contained. So let's take a look at this. So I've got function stopwatch, and inside there I say let start time equal date now, and then inside of there I've got a function called get delay. Now it says let elapsed time, so it creates a variable called elapsed time, and it's set to date now minus start time. Okay, and then we go ahead and say alert elapsed time. So let's take a look at what just happened there. So the very first thing it does is it grabs the time. Then there's a function here called get delay. So remember, this function isn't called yet. It's not called until we get to this return get delay. So then it calls that function, which basically grabs now and subtracts the start time. Now again, we're talking about milliseconds here, because by the time it did this and then it got back around to that function being called, milliseconds would have basically passed. So then we go ahead and say let timer equal stopwatch. So this function then gets called at that point, which it sets the start time. Then it basically calls the get delay, which sets the elapsed time, and then it basically displays the elapsed time in an alert. Okay, And then what we're going to do is do something that takes some time. So we're going to do a for loop that will reset variable I to 0. Remember, the first part of that very first part of the for loop is done at the very beginning of the loop and never done again. Then the check at the beginning of every loop is if I is less than, what is that, 100,000? 1 million. Yeah. And at the end of every loop, we add 1 to I. And then we say let foo equal math.random plus 10,000. So math.random is just going to go grab a random number. It's going to add 10,000 to it and put that into foo. Okay? And then it calls the timer. So basically timer then is called, which then calls stopwatch. And that so this is going to happen after this happens. Okay, so let's take a look at it. So if you saw that, 42 seconds basically happened between the start time and the elapsed time. So I run it again. It's different each time. And why is it different? It's because of this random number that gets basically brought in. So it's either going to run longer or shorter, depending on what random number is brought in to basically add 10,000 to. So the whole point of this is we get a start time, and then we get this delay, depending on what's going on here. So this guy here gets called once, then it gets called again, and it basically then displays that. So we can see so when the stopwatch starts, we do this whole rigmarole here in this for loop, and then it gets called again, and we can see what the elapsed time is. That number is going to be different every time. There's 99, 31, 67. So you can see there's a whole lot of different numbers, random numbers being generated at that point. Okay. So I really want to clarify what's going on here. So, and we're talking about closure, and we're talking about what can see what, and everything that's kind of going on with this. So here's how this works. Right here we have this function. We've got a function inside of it. So I say let timer equal stopwatch. So this function is called, okay? We create a variable called start time, and it's set to what it is right now. Down here, I say return get delay. So that is basically sitting, it's kind of sitting there waiting to be invoked. So this guy is not invoked yet. Okay? This guy was created, but this function has not been called yet, okay? Because we're saying return it, so that's it. It's not actually being executed yet. So this guy was set right here. Then we do this big for loop, depending on what the random number is, and it basically goes all that. Then right here is where that return statement is going to be invoked. When I call timer, that basically then invokes this return, which calls the function, and then displays the alert. Okay? So right here, when I say return get delay, the alert is not executed yet until we basically invoke it by calling timer. Okay? So I want you to really understand that. This guy gets created right off the bat. This function is called via this return, but it's not invoked until we actually invoke the object that is set to stopwatch. Down here, when I call timer, that invokes and just sets the return to basically call the function, which basically calls the alert elapsed time. Okay. So, yeah. So we have this outer function and this inner function. This outer function, again, I want you to realize too that when this guy is set right here, it's actually sitting right here. It's executed this first part, the outer function, but it hasn't executed the inner function yet. And so there's no closure at this time. There's absolutely no closure because it's sitting right here. It hasn't even called that function yet. It does all this. Now when I call timer, it then calls that function. We have closure on the inner function, and then we have closure on the outer function. Okay. So, I do want to point out at the end of every chapter, there are a place to ask questions. There's also some practice exercises, some links there. I think I also have them here as well. Yeah. Yeah, bit coding exercises. So if you click here, there are some different coding exercises. They are kind of somewhat complex, a lot of things we really haven't covered, but you can kind of click on them to see how to basically create them. And it will actually give you the code to basically put that together. So, yeah. So here's the code. You got to put the script in there. Yeah. So anyways, just realize those are there as well. Okay, so let's take a look at chapter 10. So here we have chapter 10, Hello World. So if you want to bring that up. Yeah, anytime you need to look at the code, you can pause the video, bring up the code, and then basically you can kind of follow along. Okay, so here I've got, so this is kind of putting everything all together. So here I've got my style, I've got a body tag, I've got my H1, so we've got some CSS in here so we can format our text. Then I've got body, are you ready for this? Are you ready for seeing, already have seen the amazing dialogue ever? And then inside of there I've got script, alert, hello world. So when we run this, there's our alert, hello world, and displays. Now, it's kind of hard to see what just happened there, but it really truly starts at body and builds the web page line by line by line. But what happened was it basically got it loaded that and then did the script that we didn't even see it load that until after we closed out the alert. But the are you ready for this? And so these two lines were there. We just didn't see them yet because it executed so fast. So it does do it sequentially. Another thing too is where do we put the script tag? We can actually put script actually up in here in our heading. We can put it there. We can actually put the script anywhere. They highly suggest that you do put it at the bottom of your HTML. That way there, it basically makes sure that all of the HTML and the CSS, make sure all those things are processed first before it actually then gets to the, because it could actually corrupt things. I'm 99.9% sure it won't, but there is some delicate procedures going on there, so that you do need to make sure the script tag, that should be right before the ending body tag. We can have, we're going to call things, we're going to do certain things, and we are going to have our text. We can have our JavaScript affect our text as well. So we can have we can have our JavaScript inside of our HTML. We can also have it as a separate file all by itself. And the reason we might want to do that is, let's say I've got Java code I need to have on this web page, this web page, this web page, this web page, and this web page. Well, I don't want to copy and paste all of that Java code into each one of those different items, because now what happens when that Java code changes? Well, I'd have to go into each one of those web pages and modify that Java code. Instead, what we can do is I'm going to open up this the code lives in separate files. So here we'll see that I have it's pretty simple. So I've got an example, a heading 1 tag, and it says example. And in here I've got script, src equals chat10 example.js. Okay, so if I look and open up, so I'm going to open up, so here it is, the ch10 example, and it's a JavaScript file. It has a .js extension. If I open that up, this is what it looks like. I've got a function called showDistance, and there is, and we've seen this before. This is the same exact code we've had in one of the very first JavaScript examples we utilized. But there is my speed and time, and I do alert speed times time, and I call that function 4 different times. So we've seen this code. So really all that's doing is right here where I've got this script, source chapter 10 JS, it just brings that file in and copies it and pastes it right inside of there. Now another thing we can do is we might utilize, so let me comment this out. So I've got the same exact code stored on my personal web page, and it's going to basically bring that in as well. I think if I were to copy that link and put it out here, I think it might show us what it looks like. Does it? Nah, it won't, because it's a JS file. That's right. It has to be an HTML or HTML extension in order for a browser to utilize it. So anyways, so it's going to do the same exact thing when I run this. There's the example. Maybe it can't get to my code. Yeah. So let me change it back. It might not be able to get back to my code. So so that's saved. Let me see, run it again. Yeah, there it is. So now it's calling each one of those within that JS file. But the whole point of this commented out part is to let you know that your JavaScript code doesn't have to reside right here. In fact, there are JavaScript files that if you go out and do a search, you can find folks who have JS files that you can point to and use them. So you don't have to write that code. You can just use their file in your program. Now, the bad thing about doing that is you have to rely on them to make sure that code's always there. And if they update their code, or maybe their website goes away or whatever, now you're kind of in a bad situation. So, but that is available, and it basically it's done all the time. So it's really, really nice. As we saw when we talked about CSS files, where you can have an external CSS file, same thing there as well. You can actually reference an external CSS file on a completely different website. So those really make life a lot easier that way. So and that's really all that chapter is basically talking about. On page 117 kind of goes into more what I talked about earlier, and it says that when your browser parses the HTML page, it starts at the very top and moves down line by line. When it basically comes to a script tag, when it hits this, it automatically starts executing the code within that. It says, and the next paragraph down, it says technically, like I said earlier, your script tags can live anywhere in your HTML document. There's a preferred place you should specify your scripts, though, because of how your browser parses the page and blocks everything while your scripts are, because that's, I didn't really go into that either. When it executes that script, it stops everything else, so no other HTML tags are being executed at that point until it gets done with that script. So it says, blocks everything while your scripts are being executed. You want to place your script tags towards the bottom of your HTML after all the HTML statements. If your script tag is towards the top of your document, your browser will block everything while it is running. This could result in users seeing partially loaded and unresponsive HTML pages if you're downloading a large script file for executing. So if you have a very large JS file and you've got it at the top, you might see things kind of sort of pop up on the screen. Until that JS gets loaded in and executed, it could stop of how your page is getting loaded. But if you have it at the bottom of your HTML code, your page will load up and then it will execute the script file. And again, I was talking about a little bit of corruption there as well. It talks about which approach to use, and just like I said earlier, is if you have a situation where you need to have the same JavaScript on, I don't know, 5 different web pages, 3 different web pages, 2 different web pages, you don't want to duplicate it. Okay, you don't want to copy and paste one page other. Create a JS file and basically use that external file. So now if you need to change the JavaScript code, you only have one place to basically paste in there. Another reason is, what if that JS file has got a whole lot of code in it? Okay. Well, if that code is sitting in your web page, it might take a while for that web page to load up. Whereas if you basically just have the HTML tag and then you call that script file, it basically will load all that HTML code first and then call that script and load it in. And you might see a little bit of a delay, but you won't see that much of a delay. So, okay. Well, that's pretty much it for chapter 10. Okay, go ahead and pause this video and go ahead and do JavaScript class lab number 3. And when you're done with that, come on back. Okay, so we are going to continue on to chapter 11. And chapter 11 is a way for us to do testing and see kind of where things are at inside of our HTML code. And we can do that through this thing called the console. And so the console is built into a web browser. So let's go ahead and open up chapter 11 console example. So here I've got, looks like I'm using some CSS here. I've got my button, I've got some other things. Again, those are going to be, so it looks like they're using an ID and for my button and a container. Okay, so I've got a div ID container. The button is my button. It says click me. And then here it says let my button, so there's the ID my button, is equal to document.query selector my button, and my button.add event listener click do something, and basically false. We'll talk about event listeners in another chapter, so I don't want to get into all that right now. So function do something. So it's going to call right here, when I click on my button, it's going to call the do something tag. Okay? And what it's going to do, it's going to do a console.log, is this working? Okay? So let's go ahead and run this, and let's see what this is all about. So I ran it, and there it says click me. It's all done. Okay, what the heck just happened? Well, if we do this, if we press F12 on our keyboard, it brings up this little section right here. And what it does is it brings up, again, if this was an HTML class, we would really go into depth on this, because we can actually come in here and play around with things and modify things on the fly. It doesn't save it to the file, but it's just kind of a way for us to kind of experiment. We can kind of expand all these different things. We can go in and change things and then rerun it right here to see how it looks. Again, it doesn't save the code that way. It just lets us experiment. One of the things up here at the headers at the top up here is console. And when I click on console, you'll notice it says, is this working? So here in the code where I say console.log, is this working, instead of actually writing it to our web page and doing alerts and that type of thing, we can actually throw it to the console and we can see if things are working that way as well. So it's kind of a nice way to not modify our web page or not do alerts, not do document writes, that type of thing, and test our JavaScript. Okay. Sometimes what we'll do is we'll log stuff. So if we're doing something, we can actually just log it to the console. And that way there, if we ever need to see, is this particular item working properly, we can then basically open up that console to see, yeah, did it work quickly? And we can see in our account, yeah, it did. So kind of a nice way to do that. So, so the console is a really, really cool way to not utilize our screen and modify things there. We can actually just see it behind the scenes, really. So, yeah. So this E is basically what we're currently looking at. So it's kind of like taking everything that we've got right now and throwing it into E. So all of our code kind of gets thrown in there, and that's what this do something does. And because it's basically, well, that the false is being put in there as well. So again, we'll really dive deep into this add event listener when we get into, I think it's chapter 36 or 34, which is, I think, week 6. So anyways, just be aware that we can write things to the console instead of writing it on our screen if we don't want it to pop up everything. So if we take a look at, let's open up Go Beyond. So chapter 11, console, Go Beyond. I think that's pretty much the same exact thing we just did. Yeah. Apparently I don't understand the difference. Okay. So let's do this. Let's open up console warnings and errors. And this is kind of cool because so pretty much the same thing, except this time we've got let my button equal document query selector my button. And then we go ahead and build this add event listener. Again, we're not there yet, but just realize it's basically going to display a button that we can click on. We're going to create a variable called counter set to 0, and then we got a function called do something, and there we got counter ++. Then I got console log. We clicked on E target ID. So E is the current basically event that we're basically dealing with, which will probably be this event listener right here. If counter is equal to 3, show more. So it's going to call the function show more. And show more basically does a console.warn. This is a warning. Console.error. This is an error. So what this is trying to show is if we want to display a warning, and we want to see how that looks in the console, we can actually do console.warn. Console.log just writes to the console. Console.warn and console.error do two different things. They change the text and they make it look a lot different. So if something within our code that we want to capture is maybe it's doing an error, but it's not a bad error, we can do a warning. If it's a bad error, we can go ahead and do a .error. Okay, so let's take a look, see what this looks like. So I'm going to go ahead and run console warning and errors. I click on Click Me. Okay, we don't see anything until we do F12 on our keyboard. We bring that up and we go to console. And maybe I gotta close these two out first. Okay, let's try it again. F12. There's my console. And if I expand this, we clicked on my button. If I click on it again, there it is. So then it comes up and says, this is a warning. Notice it's in a yellow font, and it's got this little triangle with the exclamation point showing that that is a warning. When I do a .error, it's got the red circle with the X and says, this is an error. And if you expand that, it basically says, online, so in the Chapter 11 Council Warning Errors.html line 47, it basically says that was the warning. And it was basically called by this do something on on line 42. If I go to error, same thing. It says that when the show more was called, basically on line 48, and basically it was called by line 42. So it's kind of giving you some nice pointers of where things kind of happen. So you notice the log, it really doesn't give us anything that we can go on, except on the right hand side over here it says that the log was put on line 39. So if I go back over here and look on line 39, I can see that's where the council log happened. Over here I can see on line 48 is where the warning happened, and it was called by line 42, which is show more. So the show more was called by line 42, and this is where it basically called the error on line 47, on line 48, and the warning was called on line 47. So again, we can get very, very descriptive on our logs and that type of thing. It says on page 134, it says there are more council methods. The warning error methods is just kind of the one of the main ones that are used, but there are others, and we can actually look those up on the internet and see what those are as well. Okay. Okay, the last chapter we're going to cover is chapter 12, and it's pretty not a whole lot of stuff we have to do. It's more informational than anything. It really talks about the different data types that we have available to us, and I'm going to open up the table that's on page 140 called types, and we'll talk about them. So it says, first of all, we got a string. Now, string is just basically text. It's textual data. So anytime there's just text, anything like double quotes around it, that's considered a string. Then we have numbers. Obviously, we know what that is. And then Boolean, I kind of touched on this a little bit. Boolean is true, false. So we either have it's true or it's false. Behind the scenes, it's really a 1 or a 0. 1 is true, 0 is false. Null means it's got absolutely nothing in it. And when we see something with nothing in it, we usually get what's next there is called undefined. Undefined says, I can see this item, but I can't make heads or tails out of it. So it's kind of like null. So when JavaScript deals with the null, it doesn't know what to do, so it comes back with undefined. We have big int. Now there are different numeric values, and Java just treats them all as numbers. But we do have what's called an integer, and those are whole numbers, no decimal points. We have what are called doubles or floats. Those are basically numbers with decimal points. Those are called primitive values. So when we have a variable that is a primitive data type, that's it. That's all you have. It's just a numeric value, and that's it. And big int basically allows us to go beyond what is contained within a small integer. So basically, it's a way for us to deal with very, very large numbers. And then we have a symbol, and this is what's called immutable. Immutable means that once it's set, it can't be changed. and these are usually used with objects. We'll talk about objects here in a second. And objects, now objects are, there's a whole lot of stuff going on there. If you ever take an object-oriented class, you're going to find out that when you have an object, you have what are called, I call them the nouns and the verbs. The nouns are the fields that you can store data in, and the verbs are things that it can actually execute. So it actually has execution statements that it can actually do things. The different types of objects that we have are on the top of page 143, and we have what are called arrays, and we're going to cover those in chapter 13, so we'll get more into that too. And it allows us to take a group of items, put them together in a group, and then each one has its own index number attached to it. So if I throw, now they all have to be the same data type. So I can throw a bunch of numeric values in there, I can throw a bunch of strings in there, and then once they're in there, I can pull them out by their numeric value. So the first person that goes in, and again, it'll make a lot more sense once we get to chapter 13. Boolean, again, is that's another data type. It's basically says it's a wrapper around a Boolean primitive, so for a primitive data type. It's just when it's true or false. Date, so a date, there's a lot more going on there with dates. Gregorian and all the different types of date factors that are there. A lot of times it could just be just a numeric value, a big long string of numbers, but depending on how we want it formatted within the object itself, it can come back as month, day, year. It can come back as just a month or just a day or just a year. Functions, and we saw functions, they have a lot of stuff going on inside of them as well. So they have data that they can store, so they got a variable that they can store stuff in, and then they actually execute and do something. So function is also an object. Math is kind of a built-in function that built into JavaScript that actually gives us things that I think like pi and square root and those types of things. So it actually gives us more options. I can actually, instead of doing 3.14159, I can actually use like the math.pi. And then we got numbers, so that basically is a wrapper around primitive numbers. Regex is basically, I don't even want to, regex is really, really powerful, but it's really, really hard to understand. So what that does is it allows us to take, and we can come up with a formatting factor and say, when you see this, take the data and format it with these different types. If you want to look up regex out on the internet, you see that it's very complex. And then string is basically another object or data type of an object that we can utilize. There's predefined stuff, and then there's stuff that we can define. So as you saw when we were creating variables, I would say this is basically equal to 0, or this is equal to some text literal stuff. We were basically creating data types at that point. So this chapter is just really trying to get you acclimated to some of the different verbiage that we'll utilize when we create different variables and the data types that these variables will contain and that type of thing. So you can read chapter 12 and they kind of go through this whole pizza scenario, but yeah, it's important. It's an important chapter, but because it really kind of gets us used to the different features, or I should say the different data types that we'll be utilizing within JavaScript. When we cover different languages like Java or Python or VB.NET, we spend a lot of time on what the different data types are and what they can hold and what they can do and that type of thing. Okay, so this is it for week 4. So go ahead and look up the homework assignment and get that done. Again, if you have any questions, give me a call. And we'll see you next week.